Most welcome to the first pod in English from the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences on the way of Sweden into NATO with a focus on deterrence and resilience. This pod will deal most of all with the situational awareness needed in order to see the problems ahead for the coming years, and will focus more specifically on very uncertain situations with the upcoming US elections, European elections, situation in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and of course as regards China. So most welcome to this pod where Michael Sahlin and myself, Lars-Erik Lundin, will have a dialogue on the way ahead. Let me say that our most immediate conclusion and hypothesis for the work ahead, this is a pre-study for the main project, which will run over 2 years, is that Europe will need to do much more, both on its own and within NATO. Hope that you enjoy this pod. First, a brief summary. I'm joined by Michael Sahlin. Michael starts by reminding listeners about things happening right now with China, with Turkey, with the United States, and of course with Sweden and NATO. Not to forget the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. We are entering uncharted territory, dangerous times, no functioning global security system. I continue by referring to the request by the Swedish Defense Minister at the annual meeting of the Academy for advice from the Academy. So we ask ourselves in the project, what is our added value? Something is missing, of course, when you look at the official documents. And that's where the clue is probably. Because these official documents that we have seen in the last months and years focus on what the West has to do. They do not speculate so much about problems that we might face in the West when trying to reach those goals. We are on our side in the project in a situation where we can be open, academically free. Conceptually, we will try to be clear. We try to avoid endless enumerations of difficulties that only make people passive, giving up hope. At the same time, we feel that alarmism is warranted at the present time, as argued by Michael in this podcast. The relationship between the concept of peace and security proves once again to be much more complicated than most people have realized, perhaps. So is the concept of war, where the United States currently is cautious diplomatically in the Middle East, betting on functioning deterrence. And so is, as I note, the concept of freedom, which sometimes can be associated with regime change and actually provoke war. The current problem with Belarus being a case in point. Search for freedom means hard security. That's what we need to take into our heads. Governments can be less open about, for instance, the implications of another Trump administration than we can be in the project. So we can be a little bit more candid, perhaps, in the interest of our country and of the West in facing the difficulties ahead.
I imagine that we might begin our conversation today by highlighting things that are happening this very week, which serve as a reminder of all the things that are at stake, especially if we look forward to the next year of extreme density of developments, and also for the duration of the project's 2 years. This week, we see, for example, a summit happening in San Francisco in the context of the APEC meeting between President Biden and President Xi. And this, of course, has everything to do with the global stability of things and the global trends, global developments. And of course, they are going to discuss one of the key items of world global security, which is over Taiwan and the dynamics that are occurring daily over that potential crisis, Taiwan. But there are others. Similarly, this week, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Turkish Parliament will take up the question of membership for Sweden in NATO. If that is a sign, I'm still in doubt, but if it is a sign that things are now moving fast, then we might even be members of NATO in time for the NATO Foreign Ministerial that is occurring on November 28, 29, i.e. very, very soon. And the question, of course, is could there be further delays inbuilt into the process nonetheless? And that, of course, has everything to do also with relations between Turkey and the US. And that relationship is mixed with so many other items of the agenda, including the question of whether there can, in this strained moment of foreign policy on the part of everyone, if there can be an agreement on delivery to Turkey of F-16 planes, which have been seen as for a long time as a precondition for Turkey accepting Sweden. We'll see, but this happens this week on this Thursday. And of course, we have the question of the functionality or dysfunctionality of the US as a political system and as a deliverer of stability to the world. And I'm referring there, of course, to the agonizing negotiations happening this very week, even as we speak, over the federal budget. And the deadline arriving fast this Friday. And if there is no agreement on the budget there, then the federal government will cease to be functioning, financially speaking. And there are so many ifs and buts into that very process, but it is a reminder of the big issues pertaining to the domestic policies inside the US facing next year. And then, of course, we have the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine raging with enormous uncertainties. All this is, for me, a reminder that we are in a situation of uncharted territory in the post-Cold War context. Some would say even in the post-World War II context, depending on how far back you would like to look, in view of simply, for example, the basic fact that in spite of strategic deterrence and everything that we have relied on, the war in Ukraine was still possible, and that raises enormous questions about deterrence in a new era, and also the question of whether world security is somehow falling apart as a result of lacking global capacities to deal with many crises at the same time. We have, after all, according to the Uppsala archives, some 50 plus or so conflicts in the world now, an increase by some 20 compared to only 20 years ago. And some of those conflicts are very much non-trivial. They are threatening to world stability because they tend to be arenas of larger conflicts, a bit like the situation in the Cold War, when local conflict tended to be exploited by the bigger conflict between the two sides of the Cold War. So we are in an interesting situation, and when I say interesting, I mean very, very dangerous, in fact. And let's talk about the US. Let's talk about the Israeli war over Gaza and of course Ukraine as an example of unusual, uncharted experiences of big conflicts without there being a functioning global security system that can deal with them, and this in turn as a result of emerging lack of trust between parties and seismic movements on the tectonic plates of geopolitics.
Yeah. So when I was listening to the Swedish defense minister yesterday at the annual dinner of the academy, He was in a rather somber mode, addressing the SACEUR, sitting at his table, addressing our commander-in-chief, addressing our academy, saying basically that he and the government needs advice from the academy about security policy developments. And the question one puts to oneself is, then what can we do which the government is not already doing with all its analytic resources, intelligence establishments, and so forth? And of course, lots of experienced people inside the different structures on the both military and civilian side, diplomats out there in the world. I was thinking about that because, of course, when I read the various reports from the government, including the Defense Committee, which has published the security policy report this year. I read the advice given to the government by the Commander-in-Chief, Michael Budin, recently. I see something lacking or something missing, which is quite natural, because you obviously want to say things that in those papers that focus on what Sweden has to do and what NATO has to do, what the EU has to do in cooperation with all the friends in the Western world, so to say. Mm. And you don't want to speculate too much about problems on the Western side, but you have already hinted that there are quite a lot of things that might happen on the Western side that might undercut our ability to be resilient in this struggle and to be united in this struggle for peace, towards peace, but also with the maintained sovereignty and territorial integrity of the friends of ours, including to a very, very important extent Ukraine in its present struggle. So what can we do in this situation? You say we are in uncharted territories. We have all these conflicts there. And I remember that during the Cold War, we used to have a whole science around these conflicts. I mean, what conflicts in Sovietology were allowed, which type of conflicts were deemed to be too dangerous. For instance, nuclear conflicts, conflicts in the Middle East developing into nuclear confrontation was deemed to be too dangerous. National liberation struggles were okay, but there was always a limit to what was really acceptable from a great point of view. And when you came to such situations, as you no doubt did in October 1973, in the October War, then the superpowers in those days, with Kissinger and on the one side and Nixon, of course, and on the other side, Brezhnev, came together, instituted an agreement about how to prevent further escalation of such conflicts. Now that doesn't really work either. So how do you think one should tackle all this? You mentioned concepts, clarity of concepts, clarity of thinking. On the academic side, in the academy analysis, of course, a certain openness and honesty about what really is happening, and a willingness to learn from what has happened over the last 3 or 4 years. So where would you start trying to tell someone who would like to see more clarity and not just an endless enumeration of difficulties, so to say?
Yeah, well, it's a hard one to respond cleverly to, because in my sort of worldview right now, it is not wrong to be clear about the degree of danger, and I don't feel so analytically afraid of being seen to be alarmist or anything, because the reality itself is threatening or challenging that. So, but I would start, I think, with the concept of peace. because once you have a situation of lack of stability, lack of divergency, lack of convergency as basic trends, and then you have sort of the mega trends somehow being looming large while we're dealing with the geopolitics of the more near-term things. I mean, it's there are so many things, and it's not easy to be both optimistic and realistic at the same time in situations like this. When I say peace, of course, we all want peace because we know, don't we, Lars-Erik, that war is hell, and that there is always the realization, somehow historically speaking, that war may have seemed to be inevitable or even necessary, even required or needed. Because of the perceived aggression that you're exposed to. But nonetheless, having endured the war, so many tend to say no for no more wars. We said that after the First World War, we said that after the Second World War. We stated that as a mixture between hope and real belief that there will be no more wars after the Cold War. But then somehow history tends to prove that peace is a necessary thing. But in some cases, you need to balance the quest for peace with the quest for security or self-defense. Or I mean, there was no use in talking about peace with Hitler's armies storming in the various directions. Then in the end, it was decided by the likes of us that unconditional surrender by the evil forces of Hitler was a necessary price to be paid and the necessary goal to be pursued. So historically speaking, there is always some dilemmas involved in the quest for peace. Although you and I realize that war is hell and no one should have to suffer what the Ukrainian people is now suffering, or what Palestinians in Gaza are now suffering, or what the Israelis were suffering on October 7, etc., etc. So this is a hugely important dilemma. In my view, and in direct response to what you ask, we need as an academy to shy away from the necessary caution in any political document or sort of official document, because they always need to be balancing against, they have a political message kind of function. And this means sometimes, like, for example, if Lars-Erik may give you one example, when there are texts written about the way the US, in its huge dilemma over how to handle the Israeli-Gaza Hamas crisis, being faced with aggression by actors from the resistance grouping in the Middle East, daily attacks against U.S. troops in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. But to acknowledge that this is being in a state of war doesn't serve U.S. interests right now, because caution is a must for the U.S. because the acute crisis over Israel and Hamas and everything is more important. One hopes, therefore, that deterrence should be sufficient to somehow keep at bay those forces that attack the US. And if you were to call it war, then you would have limited your freedom of action. It's just one example. The way political messaging militates against analytical clarity, in our case as an academy and as Sweden. And as a European nation and as Europeans, I think it's a high time to call things by the right name, regardless of the consequences, not trying to match what political leaders have to match whenever they speak about the reality.
Yeah, you have another concept, freedom, which is also a problematic and not easy to handle concept. I was thinking about it when when I read about the current recent statement by the Swedish foreign minister visiting Vilnius, speaking about Belarus the other day, talking about the fact that you even now have an ambassador officially appointed in the Swedish government who is accredited, so to say, to the independence movement in exile in Belarus.
Yes,
and this is an interesting question, because we know that from the OSCE, for instance, much of the NGO community is focusing on freedom in the sense of regime change. So, of course, you know that if you are talking about regime change in a country like Belarus, you are talking real hardball, so to say. It's not a small thing to ask for freedom in such a country without facing.
It is hard security.
Yeah, it's hard security, and it means that you need to follow up with your statements with some real readiness to take action to defend your line of thinking. So that's another example of where you need to be, in an academic context, very analytical to try to understand coolly what it means to push for something which is probably perceived as a declaration of war on the other side in Moscow and in Minsk.
One has to add here, I think, Lars-Erik, that political messaging based on official documents, etc., they serve the purpose of signaling in various directions to the adversary, if that is the case, to friends and allies internationally, and to the Swedish population, if we talk about Sweden. And this mixture of message of recipients of messages makes for a balancing game, because every state needs to preserve as much as possible its freedom of action. Another example would be if we are, for example, talking about the US and are trying to or seeking clarity of language, analyzing the problems of the US, and we'll come to that, I hope. Then if you're a government, you need to consider that if you are saying that a next Trump government or administration would be a disaster for this and that reason, you can't do that perhaps, because you need to be able to live with it should it occur nonetheless.
It's one day after, so to say.
And the day after thing is so important as a concept, and that applies both to Ukraine and to Israel, Hamas, and to the US, and also, of course, to the Taiwan. If you're looking at that part of the world, it's so important, and I think that we academics we serve our governments and our peoples and our colleagues abroad best by being as clear as possible without having to take those cautionary concepts that are necessary if you're a responsible government.
I mean,
in the interest of plurality of clarity.
You have, of course, personally taken a bit of a heat over the last year or so, when you have discussed what kind of posture is useful for Sweden to maintain in its negotiation with some key countries, including Turkey, of course, Hungary, and so on, where you have argued that you need to always look at what happens next, so to say. What is the and we have one favorite concept, or two concepts, that we have been discussing over the last years in our different podcasts. And that's the notion of action reaction, so to say, that you always have to see that there are two, at a minimum two, in every dialogue. And that we have to be able to deal with the counter reaction to what we say. When we pursue our policies, and
say or do.
So in sometimes, for instance, in negotiations, you have this French concept of demandeur, of putting forward something in order to make clear that you really want an agreement on something, whereas others would argue that no, demandeur is no good because then you give away your positions in a way which may actually hurt the outcome of the negotiations. And it seems to me that this whole period that we have witnessed now during the previous Academy project from 2019 on is a whole history of action reactions where things have happened that people have almost ridiculed, saying, oh, the southern dimension is not important, we should focus on things which are close to us. No, there could not be a major war in Ukraine. There could be a limited war, but not a major war in the Ukraine. No, the Russians will not manage this war. They will not be able to generate enough force in order to sustain a struggle against, which in reality is a struggle against, or a war against NATO. No, we are not likely to see the rejuvenation of the Trump movement again. Now we are seeing that he is leading 5 or 6 swing states, more or less, in the polls. There are so many things that are happening, and our reaction to those, incredulity, we are not believing that it's actually going to happen. We are trying to rationalize, and then even if he would come, we are rationalizing that by saying, oh, but in that case, there would be reasonable people who would. So all of that, I mean, it's an extraordinary sequence of events where people have been constantly flabbergasted about what has actually followed each assumption. Or is this going to continue, you think?
Yeah, well, let me first, while considering that question, say that we have been used to, not a lull, because there's always been a sort of a debate about possible trends and worst case scenarios, etc. There has been in the hearts and minds of many of us in the West a feeling that normality will probably prevail. And plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose in French. More things change, the more they remain the same. It can be exaggerated while being interpreted, but somehow an expectation that things will not be, the worst case will never occur. I remember from my time being very much involved in the Yugoslav wars, where there was a saying in the 90s that every day the worst case is proven to be correct. That was the saying, i.e. a constant sequence of disappointments compared to expectations. And similarly, but now on a global scale, we have seen, and I think it's so important to compare here, the Trump era in the US and the Putin era in Russia, maybe also the Xi era in China, but it is somehow more long-term. So that, as you say, so few, even those that were strongly advocating Sweden to seek NATO membership and strongly warning that things ugly could happen. But in the mainstream, to imagine that there would be no normalization reflex somehow hitting back, but Putin went all the way to full-scale war. It is seen by many to be completely incredible, or at least at the time. Now it is a reality.
Yeah.
And well, some of our colleagues would say, I told you so, but most would doubt, even if you were strongly anti-Russian in your overall attitudes, for Putin to go all the way to a full-scale war. Incredible. And similarly, I remember writing something in 2016 where I was comparing the Brexit scenarios of the UK and the Trump scenarios of the US. and somehow predicting or at least discussing how similarly, in the case of Brexit, it was sort of a crisis scenario that seemed to be unimaginable at the time, but it still happened. Having the UK breaking up from the European community, which was incredible. And then all the harm that were done against what the beliefs of at least the many in Trump's US. And now you see the Trump factor playing out. It was sort of prepared during his first 4 years, but the resistance of the US institutions proved but narrowly capable of pushing back, preventing some of the worst instincts by the then leader. I can say this because I'm not politically responsible. And now you have a situation where Trump is, according to most, it is at least a distinct possibility for him to be back, incredibly enough, in the White House. But now it's a different Mr. Trump that we're talking about. It's deeply further radicalized and very much revanchist disposed. And all the harm that he can do should he win. And this is why I keep saying to you and others that we have to have a really strong look at what's happening in the US, because that is so important to world security.
I had a very short but still interesting, I think, exchange of views with Ambassador Mats Bergqvist in one of our earlier podcasts in Sweden about Mersheimer and his views about the position of the United States, which in my perception tend to lead to the conclusion that isolationism is a normal reaction to his description of the situation in the world, that the United States is actually in a hopeless situation. It cannot give away its relationship to Israel, but it also cannot solve the problems. It has to muddle through to try to manage its engagement in the Middle East in the way it's tried to do in many earlier periods. Similarly, in the Ukraine, the Russians are regenerating their defense industry and are coming back with in enormous potential numbers with artillery pieces and so on, which points towards a war of attrition that no one really can win. West possibly could lose it, but there is no good scenario ahead that is clearly visible, and you have even seen that discussed publicly in Ukraine recently between the commander-in-chief and the president. And of course, there is no pivot to Asia possible in this scenario for Mersheimer. So what I was saying, that wouldn't this lead an observer in the United States, a potential voter, saying, yeah, well, so we shouldn't meddle in those things. We should try to stay away. And Mats countered my argument, said, no, it just means that they have to continue staying engaged, even if they don't succeed. And the important point there is, what do the Americans do typically when they don't succeed? Well, one could argue they do what they did during the Bush years, the son Bush, younger Bush, namely to try to engage the Europeans to take their part, take an active part in that struggle, to engage on things that may be hopeless, but where the Americans don't want to carry the full burden. So this puts us in a, when I was listening to Sakur yesterday in his nice speech to the Academy, he said, we need you, Sweden. And my question back, of course, would have been, for what?
Yeah.
Because most of our members of the Academy, our military colleagues, obviously would argue that, well, Sweden is now important as a sort of reinforcement hub for a potential war in the Nordic Baltic area. So we need to plan for that, and we need to develop our our structures, our brigades, and so forth, A2AD defense systems, and all that, in view of deterrence, preferably by denial. But what, of course, could happen, and which we probably should not shy away from, is the potential that the future American administration say, no, we want you to join us even in Asia. Who knows? They did a dramatic push for us engaging on terrorism after 9/11, and many countries said, yes, we need to go to Afghanistan, even if it didn't look very good. So what kind of diversion will we have if there are problems ahead? Let's say, well, the Balkans may still not be the perceived vital American national interest, as it was not even during the Clinton years, but there might be there might be things around Iran or whatever, where we might be asked to take a share of the burden. And this is a very, very, very difficult thing, but still very important thing to keep in mind when we make our plans for the coming years.
I think my comments on this would be to say two things. One is that we have to honestly say that whereas seeking membership of NATO, that huge step in the history of Swedish security policy, of course, also similarly for Finland, and the fact that we joined together, we tried to join together, we applied together, and all those things, meaning so much for Baltic Sea area security. But that was a response to neighboring Russia taking this aggressive step, showing that it did not simply trust any longer or comply with any longer the so-called security structure that was built up mainly and largely as a result of developments after the Second World War, after the Cold War, and the gradual build-up of norms and of rules and of structures. And somehow Russia proved that this was all seen by them as nothing, and they wanted to roll it all back. The question there, the issue there would be also that when you talk about peace and you talk about security, you always have also to consider the dynamic situation which you're dealing with. Is it one where containment of an adversary is, so to speak, enough? Or does it require us, in this case the West, to roll back or push back or be involved actively? And even containment as such, stopping an adversary from further advances, has been proving to be insufficient as a guideline for deterrence. So you have now the big question of how can Russian aggression be rolled back from Ukraine without the NATO collectively being actively militarily involved in an open war with Russia? That is the question, and let's come back to that. But I would also say that you referred to SACEUR yesterday. Yes, NATO needs Sweden, of course, and it has become a big prestige thing for Biden to see that through. And I can understand him and his team for that in terms of geopolitics of Northern Europe. Anything less would be seen to be a failure in the eyes of the adversary, Mr. Putin. But I think there is an emerging consensus among those that are dealing with security that in any scenario concerning the developments in the US, and there are many or several ugly scenarios that we need to talk about more, the answer will have to be further strengthening the European arm of a collective deterrence capacity to deal with both Russia and a bit longer term China leaning more forward in security policy. That would be a means to send the signal, at least of an intention to take a stronger degree of responsibility for the security of Europe, including Ukraine, of course. That in turn would necessitate a mixture, and all this is guarding against possible risks of the US letting go more, at least. We are talking about degrees, not absolutes here, obviously. But you must look upon this as a collective dealing with both defense, hard security, soft security, defense policy, foreign policy. And I think it's so important now to deal cleverly, intelligently with the question of enlargement of the EU and of NATO in such a way that does not militate against all the demands for support by populations, and somehow symmetry vis-a-vis political process inside the various European countries, so that you don't put too many breaks or difficulties there. And then also don't set out promises of enlargement that will prove to be difficult to comply with or to follow through. Look at the Western Balkans, for example. So it is ever so important. And this is a question of here and now, and certainly next year, to find the balance between credible military support, credibly stating a readiness to enhance military responsibility for the security of Europe, facing the risk of weakened US support, not calculating in a total break, of course, although, Lars-Erik, that could be a reality should Donald Trump win the elections. We cannot rule that out. So balancing European strength enhancement with variation, taking height for, as they say in Norway, for such developments, being ready politically, diplomatically, economically, and militarily to step up in the support for Ukraine and other countries that are threatened by Russian imperialism, including Belarus, by the way.
Yeah.
And while maintaining the unity between the various national agendas of the various European NATO countries. It's a tall order.
Yeah, and I have 3 or 4 reflections on that that you just mentioned. First,
do you agree with me so far?
No, I'm going to go through them one by one, basically. Okay. So if you take first the statement that Europe must do this, then the obvious rebuttal would be 3 or 4 years ago, oh, you can say that, but Europe will not face up to. So have we learned now that Europe can? Yes, we can. Yes, we can manage the pandemic. Yes, we can face up to the need to increase our defense budget and so on. So there is some hope, there is some optimism, that there is a lot of strain. What we have with divergent tendencies inside the union, we had some good news from a Swedish perspective. I would argue that the Polish elections were good news. Let's see what happens. That's the first point that you need to, I suppose, keep in mind. The second point is the question of enlargement and so on. There, you are actually more or less speaking the way Mersheimer did 30 years ago. Be careful what you promise Ukraine. Be careful what you say, Germany says, on the big enlargement. Are we back to that discourse again? Yes, you argue more or less that, yes, we probably have to be careful what we promise, because we can create a lot of frustration and we can create a lot of confrontation without being able to handle the consequences. So I would argue that that's correct. You need to be very realistic with what Europe can do in a situation also of a recession. We have difficulties. Third, on Europe, yes, I would agree that Europe needs to take a bigger responsibility, because security challenges are not just military. There are all kinds of security challenges, and you need to be aware of the who can deal with those challenges, where I would assume that many of them in a hybrid war situation, with economic, environmental, and all kinds of other migrational, other kinds of challenges, it's the EU that has the potential to deal with it, both in terms of engaging the private sector and also regulating what is being done across nations. So there is a supranational capability there, which does not exist in NATO as an organization. It's set up. The fourth problem is how does the US react to all of this? I would argue that, and I said so in one of our earlier podcasts, again with Mats Bergqvist and Staffan Karlsson, that my experience from the Bush years is that when the Europeans announce ambitions on the European security and defense policy, the Americans become very alert. And not just Victoria Nuland, but all Americans that I met in those years reacted with concern when Europeans said that they had ambitions. And that provoked more engagement with Europe, not less from the American side. They said, well, go ahead, do your thing, and we don't care. No, they said they want to be in there and control the Europeans to see to it that we do the right thing. And that's my final point. The fifth one is the danger in that situation is, of course, that a new American administration will try to force Europeans to take the American side in an enhanced conflict, not only with China, but also with potential other members of the global South community. And there I really want to highlight what our governor of the Academy has said in several podcasts recently, that the World Values Survey point to the need for Europe and for the West to seek friends in other parts of the world, even if we are not all the same in terms of values and orientation. But there are things where we have things in common with India, we have things in common with Brazil, and even with China. There is a complex picture where you are seeing China is both seen as a competitor and as a partner in certain respects. And there, Europeans need to be strong in order not to be forced into a situation which is totally contrary to European interests. So it's a complex situation.
Yeah, let me then build on that. I have no problem with your 4 points. I don't think they contradict what
I think they were
try to
five. There were five.
Five, okay. But let me add number 6 and 7 then, which is that regardless of how much you emphasize soft security and values, so-called values, I have become a little bit skeptical about the usage, the sloppy use of the word values. But regardless of that, we have an interesting global scene of a struggle for influence and, if you like, hegemony. I was just reading about the statement by the Organization of Islamic States, OIC, and they are an incredibly large grouping of countries, counted to 59, I think, from all over the world. They are more or less sort of totally Islamic, but they have this as a common thread. And they were having a meeting the other day, and they were unified behind statements which were strongly anti-Israeli, not least Turkish contributions, NATO member Turkey's contributions to the formulations in that statement by the OIC showed that even not only the case of Ukraine, but also the case of Israel, is somehow dividing the world and making life harder to, if one puts it this way, to preserve Western hegemony, or if one does shy away from that term for political reasons, one might say at least Western influence. The US-led Western attempts to mobilize global support at the UN level and elsewhere in the attitude to seeking to halt Russian aggression in Ukraine have been now made more complicated by the developments in Israel, because that is another dividing line in the world. And in addition, you have the enlarged BRICS grouping of countries, where the original 5 have been added as a decision being implemented as from the beginning of next year, to major Mid-Eastern countries and also Argentina. And of course, you can argue that this is a pathetically a sort of powerless grouping of countries as a collectivity, because they they encompass so many differences of views, but they have this general sort of anti-dollarization, for example, the image of world trade being so much dependent on and steered by the dollar, that it somehow maintains US influence and US hegemony, which they collectively would like to reduce, even if they are not otherwise actively anti-US. So you have now 2 major groupings of countries, one concerning Ukraine, the latter one, and the first one now mentioned, OIC, being sort of mobilized. They are completely divided otherwise, but they have this in common to be the sympathizers of Palestinian people suffering, and therefore anti-Israeli. And that is a challenge for especially for Biden. And now Mr. Cameron is back in politics in the UK, by the way.
Yes.
Interestingly, which may make life a little bit easier for Team Biden. But I'm getting back to the US, because they are the ones that have to keep NATO together, or make NATO stronger for the deterrence against Russian aggression. And then you have the EU, and then you have the OIC, and you have BRICS. So you have a tendency of proliferation not only between major states being more divergent than we like to think of things in the 90s, and also somehow more potentially at least coherent. And that makes global diplomacy tricky, to say the least. But the outcome of this depends on the war in Ukraine, how to deal with Gaza now, and developments in the US. Yeah. I think those are the main 3 points to further discuss.
Yeah. We get into the time limit of a normal podcast, I think, but a final statement from my side could be that we have used the concept of a strategic balancing act in our previous book before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Before that was clear to us that it was really going to happen. We talked about the strategic balancing act, and I think it's still a very relevant concept. Because what we might be faced with is our demands on Europe, on Sweden, on the EU, to take sides in one way or another. And so applying very simple axiom that our enemy's friend is our enemy, so to say. We have to be very, very careful. And everything you are saying is basically that there are no simple solutions. We have to live with that. There are no clear propaganda phrases that serve as a basis for foreign and security policy in those days that we live in right now. We need very, very complex equations in order to find this right balance. We cannot always be clear, but we need to at least try to be clear in our mind about the complexities, that there are no one-liners, so to say. For instance, Ukraine is not the only thing, for one thing. It is a very, very important thing. But even a small country like ours must face the requirement to be able to think about along several different tracks of policy at the same time and find ways to muddle through in an increasingly difficult world if we are going to. And I think we are going to see that problem again very soon. We have learned the lesson. Yes, we can in terms of the pandemics. Yes, we can in terms of taking important decisions on defense, in supporting Ukraine and so on. But we are also going to have to increasingly learn the lesson that we need to be able to say yes to several different things at the same time. Put more than one priority, so to say, and to blend them in a way which may be very, very difficult to say in simple terms.
But we have to also face the fact that it's not only a question of not being so sure in our conscience about the existing problems. We are facing enhanced problems overall, which for us as upcoming NATO members, including the nuclear dimension of NATO membership, by the way, meaning that we are somehow part of a struggle for deterrence, for stability, for peace. But all those concepts now in today's world needs also to take into account not only action reaction, but also offensive defensive. And if you are talking about offensive defensive, then you are into the question of, are you status quo oriented or are you revisionist? Globally speaking now, who wants to change the status quo? You remember we wrote about this in our security report in the last project. And is mere containment sort of enough, or do we need to be rolling back because we have become revisionists in response to the revisionism of others? And this creates a very dynamic scene, which we as members of NATO somehow are parties more actively than before too, because the notion of being somehow hiding out peacefully in the peaceful corner of Europe no more. NATO membership means security guarantees, but also greater security exposure, because we are members of an active alliance that has to deal with all those things, taking into account those basic concepts. If I may conclude by saying that, in my view, adding to this, Ukraine is a major challenge, and that is a banality to say, but because at the moment there is simply no way to talk about peace, as we said before, or about negotiations or compromise, because of the situation on the battleground. And if the situation now makes it rather clear that this is going to be, as much as we hate it, a protracted war, because there is no quick fix out of this, then poor Ukrainian people having to suffer for that long time. And as long as the West keeps, making Ukrainian defense possible by arms supplies, but not enough to make for a big change on the battleground, whereas Russia, having survived all the sanctions and everything, keeps pumping in massive numbers of troops, then it's a very difficult situation compared to what we said before about coherence and unity within the Western camp and within Europe. And then you have all the uncertainties of the US, because as you know, Lars-Erik, as well as I do, to have a situation where it becomes inevitable almost, right? We're not there yet, that the election will be between Donald Trump and an 81-year-old Biden with a rather inexperienced vice president. It opens up for a big drama of the US political system, as already shown today in the dysfunctionality of Congress, and that makes me rather scared, I have to say. And then finally also Middle East. I see now a big drama unfolding, which tends to unravel the whole concept of Israel, going back to the 40s and its creation, the way people in Israel being crammed into the middle part because they had to evacuate both the northern and southern parts because of the threat from Hamas and Hezbollah, respectively. And then there is, and you have this sort of shadow war being fought by the US, hoping to deter Iran from actually stepping in actively. But so many creeping tendencies risking to unravel the whole balancing system of the Middle East. And then you have Turkey. So it is very demanding, not only for the US, but for all of us being part of the Western world and the Western alliance.
And we being not what we used to be, a small country that could be seen, perceived worldwide as a friendly, benign, so to say, civilian culture with a lot of tolerance for other religions, other beliefs, in favor of humanitarian values and so on, but rather increasingly being perceived in other parts of the world as a country which is hostile to Islam, and we are being seen as a problem more than as an asset, which makes, of course, many people very sad.
A country having domestic problems of
we have a population which is completely different situation than we were during the Second World War, when people perhaps were very alerted in some stages in 1939, early 1940, about the situation where many people at their breakfast tables probably didn't talk about the war. They probably tried to concentrate on their most immediate surroundings, and now we are in a completely different media landscape where we are attacked, virtually attacked every moment of the time we are awake by all kinds of noise, be it fiction or be it reality. People soon don't see the difference anymore, and it goes all the way from individual murders of young women in Swedish small municipalities, to big-time organized crime, to wars and humanitarian catastrophes such as the one we are now witnessing in Gaza. So keeping people alive in this situation and still perceiving what is going on is, of course, incredibly demanding thing to do for a country like Sweden and for a government like Sweden. So you don't envy those in power in that sense.
No, you didn't mention the gang violence phenomenon, which is shaking the country. I think you make a very interesting point here also, and this could be a sort of concluding remark from me, which in that you compared with the psychological defense mechanisms of the Second World War. It was both a consequence of us not being part of the war, which has somehow become a part of our political culture, that we didn't do that. Some are a little bit ashamed of that, and others are proud of that. There is a big difference between those. But Sweden is such a different country now than it used to be at that time. And when we talk about that, I'm of course talking about the concepts of and consequences of migration. We have much more divided or multiple society now than we used to be. And that is an aspect which we must never forget. There are 110 million refugees nowadays in the world, according to the UNHCR latest figures. And so many millions of those have only one goal, which is to come to Europe or to the US, respectively. And to handle this, because the pressure is there and the pressure is mounting by the week and by the months, and how to handle this will have a profound impact on the sort of the cohesion of the European continent and of the whole of Europe, including Sweden. Yeah. Because it's such a concrete thing, and So we have the migration question to deal with this peacefully and honorably in a dignified way, which preserves values. And then you have the geopolitics, and then you have the as you say, the pandemics that we have overcome, but only temporarily. And then you have the climate threats. Yeah. So there are many things which will raise questions. How ready are we as a society? You made the comparison with the Second World War and the way we were spared at that time, but now we are part of a bigger alliance, which means that there is no escape from us. We are part of the Western world, dealing with all these things. Yeah. Gaining security, but also having to provide security in our small ones.
So if we are doing anything with this, is to try to seek to increase situational awareness. And situational awareness hopefully leading to the conclusion that we cannot manage this alone. We have to be, and we said that in our last book, in the last project, we need to work together with others to try to deal with the situation, because otherwise we will have to take the consequences on Swedish territory on an even higher level of violence and destruction than we are seeing now with organized crime and so forth.